Hey everyone, this is Pete, and it's rare for video game developers to tackle the subject of tragedy, because a certain proportion of gamers are predisposed to complain anytime they play through a game and don't get a happy ending. That's not to say there's no good examples of tragedy in gaming, mind. Nipponichi Software's The Witch and the Hundred Knights remains one of my favourite examples to date, and there are plenty of visual novels more than happy to focus on the sad or even horrific to the complete exclusion of anything that can be regarded as a good ending. But for the most part, it is generally assumed that if you're going to take the time to inhabit the role of a protagonist in a piece of interactive entertainment, everything is probably going to be alright in the end. The Excavation of Hob's Barrow, a point-and-click adventure from 2022 by Cloak and Dagger Games, published by genre specialist Wadjet Eye Games, is different. This is a game that makes it clear from the outset that the protagonist is emphatically not going to be okay by the end of proceedings, and yet it remains nonetheless compelling to explore, to discover the path that led her to seemingly inevitable tragedy. So let's take a closer look. Some mild spoilers will follow. In The Excavation of Hob's Barrow, you take on the role of Victorian-era antiquarian Thomasina Bateman, who is in the process of writing a book about the ancient burial mounds of rural England. As we join the story, she has just arrived in the remote and fictional hamlet of Bulley, some 30 miles away from Bakewell, Derbyshire. Bulley is a little settlement which has only just been connected to the outside world through its new railway station, in addition to the landscape which has had a somewhat mixed response from the village's rather traditionalist inhabitants. Thomasina was invited to Bulley by an individual known as Leonard Shoulder, who suggested that she might want to excavate a local landmark known as Hob's Barrow. Upon arriving in Bulley, however, Thomasina is dismayed to discover that her contact is nowhere to be seen, the locals have mostly received her with hostility, and many of them are unwilling, unable, or too afraid to even contemplate talking about Hob's Barrow. Thus begins a mystery that unfolds across several in-game days, where Thomasina has to answer several important questions. What happened to her contact? Where on earth is Hob's Barrow, if it even exists? Why is everyone so scared of it? And has her whole trip just been a massive waste of time? Answers to these questions come slowly and gradually. The Excavation of Hob's Barrow is a deliberately paced game, taking many cues from the Gothic literature that inspired it, most notably the works of the Bronte sisters, and especially Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. This is not a game about quickly discovering and confronting the truth. It is about gradually getting to know the setting and characters a little bit at a time, before finally bringing things to a dramatic conclusion in its final chapter. The Excavation of Hob's Barrow makes use of a simple, straightforward control scheme. Sweeping the mouse pointer over a scene reveals hotspots, and a button, spacebar on PC, can be held down to automatically reveal all visible hotspots on a scene to eliminate pixel hunting. Left-clicking on something takes a suitable action with it, picking up or otherwise manipulating an object, talking to a character, that sort of thing, while right-clicking examines it. Thomasina's inventory is revealed by moving the cursor to the top of the screen, and objects can be used on hotspots, characters, or each other. As a modern-day adventure game, The Excavation of Hob's Barrow mostly sidesteps the pitfalls of older titles. There's nothing in the game that can be regarded as moon logic. There are no dead man walking situations where you have no means of finishing the game thanks to missing something in a situation you can no longer return to, and Thomasina cannot die. Instead, the game is clearly designed around the theory of puzzle dependencies, as explained by veteran designer Ron Gilbert. That is to say, the game has very obviously been designed as a clear sequence of events that lead players to specific goals along the way, and that those eventual goals often have several things that have to happen first, typically running in parallel with one another. The good thing about taking this approach to puzzle design is that it provides a sense of freedom and non-linearity to the player, even if the game's narrative is pretty much on rails. If the player always has several things they can get on with doing at any one time, they feel like they have a lot more agency than if they're taking a straightforward linear route to their eventual goal. The puzzles for the first two-thirds of The Excavation of Hob's Barrow are mostly fairly gentle, making for a game that will be eminently accessible to adventure game newcomers, but not so simple that genre veterans will feel insulted by their simplicity. Thomasina offers plenty of helpful feedback and suggestions as you explore, so it'll be rare to find yourself in a situation where you're truly stuck, not knowing what to do next. In classic adventure games, having a relatively easy level of difficulty often resulted in a game that could be finished in an hour or less. So the excavation of Hob's Barrow makes up for this by its complete runtime being closer to the 6 or 7 hour mark. Still short and manageable, but not so brief that you feel the whole thing passed by in a blur. In those first 2/3 of the game, the action mostly revolves around Thomasina getting to know the residents of Bulley, attempting to figure out who she can trust, if anyone, and eventually locating and securing permission to finally excavate the titular burial mound. The Gothic aspect manifests itself in a number of ways, not least of which is Thomasina herself. While we're introduced to her as a thoroughly proper-looking and well-spoken Victorian lady in a full-length dress that doesn't show her ankles, once she's settled into Bulley, she changes out of her dress and adopts the attire she remains in for the rest of the game. Some practical trousers held up by braces, a beige shirt, and some stylish but hard-wearing boots. She looks every bit the explorer, but bearing in mind the time period the game is supposed to be set, this attire would have definitely made her stand out. And such is the case with many protagonists in Gothic literature penned by female authors, a distinction specifically picked out by the academic and literary scholar Ellen Moers in her book Literary Women in 1977, when she coined the term the female Gothic. Often writing under male pseudonyms at the time their works were originally published, female Gothic authors made use of their work to explore the role of women in society and express their various desires, societal, romantic and even sexual, and their frustration with patriarchal society. Female Gothic heroines often fled persecution and had quests of their own that they wished to accomplish, which went far beyond get married to a wealthy man. Indeed, Thomasina's very existence appears to fly in the face of what one would expect from Victorian society. She has by no means abandoned her femininity in order to pursue her chosen path, but she also faces resistance from a mostly male supporting cast in accomplishing her goals. The few other women who put in an appearance in the excavation of Hob's Barrow are rather meek, with one particularly sorrowful figure, ardent church-going widow Mrs. de Plancy, even going so far as to lie to Thomasina about saving some Bakewell puddings for the local vicar because she felt that saying she was keeping some for herself was too selfish. Thomasina doesn't take any shit from anyone though, and interestingly, rather than being shunned as some sort of heretic by the male inhabitants of Bulley, this quite quickly sees her achieving a certain amount of respect among the locals, even those who remain outwardly gruff and seemingly resistant to her very presence. The fact that she is easily able to manipulate several of the game's main characters to her advantage is testament to her strength as an empowered Gothic heroine. Empowered or not though, Thomasina wouldn't be a true Gothic heroine were it not for some lingering terror in the background. Right from the moment she arrives in Bulley, there's a notable sense of unease in the air, emphasised by the overall setting on the misty moors, and the suggestion that unexplainable, supernatural things may be occurring. Thomasina discovers evidence of things she believes to be impossible, but which are nonetheless there right in front of her. It becomes clear that some characters are lying to her, but not why. And eventually, she comes to realise that she didn't know her father, introduced to us as someone who suffered a terrible accident leaving him bedbound and unable to move or speak, as well as she thought she did. Much of the excavation of Hob's Barrow is presented in retrospective fashion, with the screen fading out to give us Thomasina's recount of the tale well after the fact following important narrative milestones. It's obvious almost from the very beginning of the excavation of Hob's Barrow that while Thomasina clearly survived whatever her experiences were, she is most definitely not in a good state. Exactly what that means doesn't become clear until the game's finale sequence, by which point it's far too late for us to be able to do anything about it. The tragedy factor in the excavation of Hob's Barrow comes about as a result of Thomasina's attachment to her father. He was the reason she became an antiquarian in the first place after all, and she has long been wishing for a way to save him from his present existence. As it becomes clear later in the story that Thomasina is in fact effectively retracing her father's steps, leading her towards the truth behind how he ended up in his current state, it also becomes apparent that there is no way she is going to turn back from what she's doing, even if it means doing some things which to an outside observer are clearly a bad idea. We're given some foreshadowing of this not only through Thomasina's retrospective narration at important story milestones, but during several sequences in the game where the solution to a puzzle is to do something morally questionable. There are 4 main examples of this. Firstly, the discovery of a seemingly forgotten silver crucifix necklace in the church leads one to believe that your task is to reunite it with its owner, but instead Thomasina uses it as collateral to set up a bar tab since her assistant forgot to send her any money. Secondly, Thomasina chips a valuable and impressive fossil out of a rock to use as a trade item, despite a stern warning from a child that doing so will anger a local god, which at this point in the narrative Thomasina assumes to be completely fictional. Thirdly, Thomasina deliberately manipulates two Bulley residents into a drunken argument with one another so she's able to pick a lock undisturbed, although in her defence in this instance it is to acquire her own belongings. And fourthly, Thomasina manipulates the residents of the village marketplace in such a way that allows her to steal some herbs she needs. To an extent, Thomasina is trapped into doing these things by the circumstances she's in, particularly her lack of money, and this is an example of the game's mechanical component lampshading its narrative elements. The conventions of adventure games are to do things or pick things up because they're there, and indeed all of the above actions are firmly in keeping with genre convention. If something appears as a hotspot, it's probably important after all. The difference in the Excavation of Hob's Barrow is that consistently throughout the entire narrative there are people, including you the player, telling Thomasina that what she's doing is a bad idea, but she goes ahead and does it anyway, because she doesn't really have a choice, both as a participant in the story and as an adventure game protagonist. Initially, this is because she's come all this way and wants to know the truth. Once it becomes apparent that her father was involved in everything somehow, it becomes a matter of her wanting to save her father, even though the scientific, rational part of her mind knows that's impossible. Indeed, that scientific, rational part of Thomasina is shown to be the direct result of her relationship with her father. Through numerous flashbacks, we see him instilling in her the love and respect for the scientific method and rational explanations for things rather than childish fancies, and Thomasina has clearly carried this rationality into her adult life. But as the plot advances, it becomes clear that there are some things going on that science can't explain. Her father discovered this 25 years ago, and as she is following directly in his footsteps, she is forced to come to the same conclusions by the end of proceedings. And this leads her to an irreversible decision at the end of the game, a decision which is out of the hands of the player and which results in tragedy. The final third of the Excavation of Hob's Barrow is where the game steps up its adventure game aspects in terms of providing more explicit, complex, cryptic puzzles for the player to solve. At this point, the game becomes more about figuring out the correct order in which to do things and the way in which the information you have access to relates to the tasks that await. Thomasina ends up literally locked into the finale sequence, so there's no turning back, even if she were to change her mind about what's going on. Appropriately enough, given the subject matter, there's a sense of ritual to these final puzzles, culminating in Thomasina's irreversible decision at the very conclusion. A decision which, thanks to her narration throughout the rest of the game, we know she has already made. We already know that what we are about to do ends in some form of tragedy, even if we don't yet know the exact form of that tragedy. We also know that Thomasina's very nature would have prevented her from turning back having come so far, even if a heavy stone door hadn't shut behind her. The Excavation of Hob's Barrow ends on a total downer, with no means of manipulating your way into any sort of good ending. While, as we previously said, this will doubtless lead to some folks feeling dissatisfied, such as one Steam reviewer who gave the game a thumbs down on the basis that there is no way to win, I have to respect a developer with the confidence to go, this is a tragedy pretty much right from the get-go, and sticking to that throughout. You don't go into a Shakespearean tragedy expecting a happy ending, nor too should you go into this expecting a happy ending either. That doesn't mean it's not worth playing or in any way unsatisfying though. It's simply a well-told, beautifully presented, wonderfully sad and thought-provoking story that will stay with you long after you roll credits. And sometimes that's exactly what you want from your entertainment. Tragedy is an underexplored theme in interactive media, and I, for one, would love to see more of it. And it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.